I'm off.
Well, we will get started here with our webinar today. We're so excited to have Lisa Ehrlich back again. She had joined us 2 weeks ago. Hopefully some of you on the webinar had joined us then when we were talking about healthy relationships and boundaries. And now she's going to talk to us about puberty and sex and how to have these conversations with your teens. So I'm going to pass it right along to her and she's gonna get us started. This is being recorded. You will receive the recording afterwards, as well as handouts, resources, all of that good friend stuff. So don't worry, all of that will be accessible to you all. So I'm gonna pass it off to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Erin. So as usual, I just want to thank the Glenview North, I can't even remember what it stands for, it's the Council for Youth. I just really appreciate that you do this for everyone. I also really appreciate that you do it at lunch so people can actually join in. There is a lot to cover, so I am going to start sharing my screen. All right, so we named this Don't Panic, and it is also the name of a resource that is on our website that I will put in the chat toward the end, and we'll also send it out in the follow-up with these. And the reason that we call it Don't Panic is because I think we do. I think we all panic about this. I am trained around this, and sometimes I even get nervous about having these discussions with my kids. But hopefully this will give you some tools. So really quickly, for those of you who were not on last week, you are not familiar with Response. Response for Teens is a program of JCFS Chicago that is dedicated to empowering young people to make healthy decisions. We do that really in 3 ways. One is our clinical focus, and we have clinicians who are completely dedicated to working with adolescents and their families. And a reminder that adolescence is really 12 to 24, 25. And they are identity affirming and trauma informed, and really have a unique talent in working with adolescents. Then you have where I am the manager of, which is the education program. And in the education program, there's really 2 big components. And one is we do classes and programming like this for families and caregivers, but we also are in schools almost every day doing sexual health programming, healthy relationship programming, and mental wellness programming. And then the other component that is a part of community education really is leadership. We have 2 programs, Peer Health Advocates, which works with young people who want to make change in one of those areas, sexual health, healthy relationships, or mental wellness. And we really help them kind of unpack power and the change that they want to make and learn what they need to learn so that they can create that change. And then we have Snowball Teen Leaders, which next week is our retreat. And if I will also, in a quick follow-up, put the information in, registration still open. It is a program where teens figure out what they want to talk about, and they learn all year how to create programs and workshops and lead a retreat, which is in Ingleside, Illinois at Camp Nagila. And it's really this amazing thing where kids from across the Chicagoland area come together. But so now I will actually get started. So if you want to put in the chat, you do not have to. I want you to think about like your child, right? what did you know about sex, or where did you get your sex information when you were your child's age? I'll take like 30 seconds if you want to type something in the chat. If you don't, that's all right as well. Mom, but not too comprehensive. Thank you. Not a whole lot. Thank you. Figured it out the hard way in college. My parents never had the talk. I was super busy with sports, so they never had time. Learned what sex was from my mom after watching Nova's The Miracle of Life. Very minimum. Agreed. In Skokie had sex ed in 5th grade. Interesting, and I'm curious about what that sex ed looked like. Um, and I think too, a lot of times schools, what we find is that sexual health education really should go kindergarten through graduation. But a lot of times it's fit in one time um, in one specific place. Great. When I think about sex ed in school, I can tell you I had a horror story. So I'm 43, and I had a book from my mom about like very similar to this Nova thing, and it was like I can't remember what it was called, but it had pictures of it was about pregnancy, not sex. It was all different fetuses and different stages of gestation. I was obsessed with it, and then I had in 5th grade a really awesome teacher who was really 3rd through 5th grade was like a family, and he was really open about sex, um, and was really straightforward about stuff. And then I got to high school, and we saw one very grainy, horrible video of a woman giving birth, and it was traumatizing. And that was it. And just like the other person who said that they were very busy with sports, so my parents assumed that I knew more than I did. And to this day, my mom thinks that she had the talk with me, and they never did, right? I also think about that scene from Mean Girls where the teacher is teaching sex ed, and he's literally like, if you have like sex, you'll get chlamydia and die. And it's just like the scare tactics involved. And sometimes with parents who don't mean to be scary, right? They were afraid for us, and that came through in how they spoke to us. So today what we're going to do, and I am going to talk a lot. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and put them in the chat. I'm really hopeful that overall this is kind of demystifying the idea of like this one big sex talk. Even though I know that a lot of parents are of high school age, if you have other kids, I'm gonna show you just what some ways to address different things at different ages around sex. Explore what I consider the key elements of any time you're talking about sex, and then build tools for communicating with your young person about sex. And actually, some of the tools that I'm going to give you are about communicating in general. So overall, I am so glad that all of you are here because caregivers matter, plain and simple. Whether it be a parent or someone else who is in the role of caregiver, even though with young people it might not seem like it, they care about their friends more. They don't want to talk to us. They roll their eyes when we try to have discussions with them. All research shows that young people are impacted by their parents. It might not seem like it, but they watch us and learn from what we do, and they learn from the way that we talk to them. The values that you show actually shape your young people, and they shape how your young people start to think about their developing sense of self and their sense of their values, right? Middle school and early high school, and even later high school, they're really figuring out who they are and what they value. Being able to see you is integral to that. Um, and one of the things is that teens, like social media shows us, social media, movies, that like all teens are doing is having sex, when that's actually not true. Research shows that most teens wait till after they're 18 to start having sex, but that's not what the media shows us, right? And then research further backs up that the more information teens have about sex ed, the more they can talk about it, the more accurate information they have, the more they choose to delay sex, right? Until they are in a place where they feel ready. So I'm going to structure a lot of today by going through these four components, right? So when we talk about this, what is important? The what is really important. What is said? When and how it's said is also important. How often it is said is important as well. And then the last one is how much the young person feels cared for and understood is really important. All of these combined creates the atmosphere for you to be able to have these discussions in an ongoing basis with your young person. And that's what it is. They should be conversations, not talks. So no matter how old your young person is, we're going to start off with this. They all need these 5 things. They need guidance about making responsible, safe choices, right? Um, and that isn't just sex, that's all of it. And especially in middle school and high school, their brains are really starting to develop and prune and understand what risks are and how to think critically about risks, right? They need affirmation and unconditional love, period. And a lot of times we assume that our young people just know that we love them. We need to remind them, and we need to affirm that even when we don't like them so much, because we don't always like them. They need appropriate boundaries and limits. You are their parents. You are their parents and caregivers, and really simply, they need boundaries and limits. And they thinking about talking them through, having a curfew, um, phone limits, um, thinking about how and when they do things, right? That's really important, that you are the people who set the boundaries, but that you set them with them. Clarity about values such as respect and integrity. What does that look like? What does that sound like in your home, right? How does that go from the people who you're in intimate relationships with to people that you're acquaintances of or people that you don't know necessarily? How do you show that, right? That's where modeling comes in, right? And then information about healthy and unhealthy behaviors, information, and that is relationships, that's sex, that's drugs, that's any decision that they might make. But what's really important, it's not you telling them what to do, it's providing them information and helping them talk through decisions. Because when we tell teens specifically exactly what to do without letting them make the decisions, that is when we see them pushing back. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through. As you have questions, please put them in. I'm going to go through each of those categories. So what is said is what's important. But the hardest thing is what's age appropriate, right? And what is age appropriate? A lot of times, and a lot of things we get from teachers, a lot of things we get from parents, are worries around telling young kids too much. And the truth is, so there are national sexuality education standards, right, where there's been a lot of sociological research on what is appropriate at what time. And it's also about how you tell it. But one thing I will say is that even if we think that they're too certain kids, right, by the time they have any type of phone or are watching TV, while we might think that they're too young to have a discussion, they are getting it anyways. And so what's important is that we are the ones who are leading those conversations, not someone or something else. So 8 to 10, and I'm starting with puberty. If you have questions about even younger, I can give you resources for even younger. But around 8 to 10, really thinking about it, puberty opens the doors for sex talks. Like, your kids have already been having good touch, bad touch talks when they're younger. Your kids, when they're younger, define their own bodies and are curious about their bodies, and it's great to start opening those. But the onset of physical changes and hormones really make this an important time, right? It also makes it a really uncomfortable time, right? So lots of curiosity might be happening, but they might ask fewer questions when then they're younger, right? Like when they're younger, they ask questions like, why does my body look different? Or something like, why is my penis standing up? And they might say that in the middle of the supermarket. And you're like, haha, they're 4. I love them, right? Like, embarrassing. But by 8 to 10, they start really starting to think about judgment. And so those questions are going to lessen, but that doesn't mean that the curiosity isn't there. You're going to want to give them really simple and straightforward answers, right? Now is a great time to start sharing books with them. And one of the resources I'm going to give you is a book list. But Sex is a Funny Word is a great book to share with young people. And it is inclusive and it's wonderful. And having them go through it with them, let them go through it by themselves, ask them what questions they have, right? Ask them what they learned. Some of the topics that you're gonna want to go through are the changes of puberty, because even if they're not experiencing puberty yet, their bodies are changing, and that's going to freak them out a little bit, right? Gender and gender norms, right? They are very attuned to what's going on, and because their bodies are changing, they're going to sometimes feel more the need to fit into gender norms, and really talking about that norms are constructed and helping them figure out how they want to be the person they are. Masturbation, totally awkward and uncomfortable. This might feel really early, but even younger, right? You might have found that your children figured out, like I think at 3 years old, 5 years old, my children figured out where their clitoris was and found pleasurable feelings. And so we started having that conversation early. And so you re-enter the conversation. It's just kind of like that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and talking about privacy. You want to be really explicit about sexual abuse, right? And so this is another conversation about good touch, bad touch, about your body is yours, right? And that no one should ever touch you in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable, and who to tell. And if it's not you, who in other places, who in school, who on the swim team, right? To have an adult in multiple places. This is also because they're experiencing self-esteem, so many changes. This is a really important part to build their self-esteem. 10 to 13. So this is where the crux of puberty, right? So puberty might have started between 8 to 10. This is we're in the throes of it. Continue with the topics that you already talked about from 8 to 10. But also remember that adolescent embarrassment is at its peak right now. And they also might really want to engage with peers and other sources like social media, and bristle at talking about it with you. That doesn't mean that you don't talk about it. So, things to make sure that you are talking about: gender identity and sexual orientation. A really important point, anytime you are talking with your kids, but especially when you talk with these, is that we don't make assumptions, right? It can be really uncomfortable when the way someone brings up talking about relationships is asking someone who we assume identifies as female about a boyfriend, right? We want to make sure that they are not, we want to use as much gender neutral language as we can so that our kids can fill in the blanks for us. The other thing that you might have is they might not start feeling attracted to anybody yet, and that is totally normal. You might also have that someone is feeling that they're not attracted to anyone and all of their peers are. And normalizing, and I'm going to show you some language to normalize that, but normalizing that is really important. Now is also a time to start talking about sexual attraction versus romantic attraction, right? You still say, for example, that we want it all in a relationship, but understanding that you can feel a crush on someone and really want to be with them all the time. And you can also have sexual attraction to someone and just have the feeling in your body, right? It's important to start talking through that. Now's the time to start talking about safer sex. People get really nervous that this is a really young age. It's not, right? So this is where you start talking about your values, right? What does safer sex mean to you? What is sex for? Is sex only for adults? Is it only for people who are married, right? How do you start communicating your values around sex? And this is really important in terms of thinking about being positive about sex and the way we talk about being healthy. With healthy relationships, you can start talking about what makes a good friend and then take those qualities into a relationship. Okay, this is 8th grade into high school. So once again, it kind of is a pile, right? You're going to keep all of those things that you've already talked about, right? You also, though, want to build agency and self-advocacy around sex and relationships, right? And in a way that you did not do when they were younger. You still want to build self-advocacy with relationships, but now you're going to take it up a notch. So you want to reinforce safety and pleasure, right? And so what we talk about a lot at Response is balancing responsibility and actions, right? So behavior and responsibility, or risk, pleasure, and responsibility, right? We try sometimes not to talk about it in terms of risk, but we really think about that's great. If you want to take this action, right? If you want to engage in sexual activity, what are the responsibilities that you need to think about so it can still feel good, but everybody's safe? Talk about mutual decision making, right? The more that you blend healthy relationships and boundaries and consent into talking about sex, the better, right? It's mutual decision making between two people. And it is about comfort and care and trust. Start getting into them about the idea of healthy communication and what is assertive versus aggressive. Sexual boundaries, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that, but really cue them into nonverbal communication, right? A lot of times we hear around consent that you have to, that like a yes is a yes or a no means no. There are tons of ways that even if someone says yes, that their body is telling us that they actually don't consent. And if they're in a relationship, that is actually harmful to the relationship. So really start thinking about how can you talk about it. In classes I'm in, I talk about playing sports. I talk about how do you know when someone wants a pass, right? We talked with them. How do you show when someone's uncomfortable, but you don't think that you can say that you're uncomfortable out loud? What does your body do, right? Kids are experts in their own bodies. They know how they feel about things. Now's the time to actually start talking about safer sex, right? Condoms. You want to make sure that you are not just talking about, you want to talk about all different types of sex acts, as scary as that is, and that and condoms, we have some lessons around what condoms can be used for, right? So that two people of the same gender, right, or two people who have the same body parts, just because someone doesn't have a penis doesn't mean that they don't need to engage in safer sex, right? And so we talk about, what does that mean? What does that look like? Birth control. Um, Start thinking about potential options, right? One of the things that we normalize all the time is that people take birth control even if they're not thinking about engaging in sex, that there's reasons why. We talk about hormone regulation and all of that, but really start talking about different types of birth control and how that, how understanding what type is right for you is actually really important. This last one is super important and sometimes one of the more uncomfortable things, right? Facilitating access to reproductive and sexual health care. So it's important to understand the law. In Illinois, minors between the ages of 12 and 17 can consent to medical treatment for STIs or receive contraceptives. A minor of any age can purchase condoms, right? So what's really important to understand is that at this age, even though they are your babies, they have the legal right to access care. What you can do as a parent and caregiver is help facilitate that, right? So when it is time to a doctor, especially if they're still going to a pediatrician, right? At a certain age, think about switching doctors. But if they're still going to a pediatrician, a doctor might not feel comfortable asking you to leave the room, but talking with your child and offering to leave the room so that your child can have a confidential conversation with their doctor, right? That shows that you trust your child. Another thing to do is to talk through STI testing. Talk through the process, right? Really demystify. One of the things that we do in response when we teach classes for high school is we actually made a video about what it looks like to get tested, because it is so scary, right? And we want people to be healthy and think about that getting tested isn't something that you do just when something's wrong, right? But really thinking about how to facilitate this access for them so that they're not on their own. I know I'm flying. All right, so in general, you're going to address the what. You're going to be simple and specific. Consent and boundaries need to be a part of every conversation that you have around sex. Talking about your family values, right? What values do you want your child to bring into all sexual situations they encounter? Fill in gaps and debunk myths. Even if you are having wonderful conversations with your kids, they are still going to be going to media. They're definitely going to be going to their friends. And you might hear some things, right? Or you ask questions and you hear answers that kind of set off warning bells in the back of your head, like, oh my God, my kid believes this myth and it's, how could they think this? Debunk myths. But here's the thing, it is okay if you don't know the answer. What's really important is to start educating yourself, but it's also really okay to tell them, why don't we look it up together, right? What to say, just like in healthy relationships, really thinking about sharing personal stories. Why are you sharing it, right? What do you want your child to take away from it? Steering your child's behavior, like making sure your kids get a moral point, is not going to, should not be the goal. And to be honest, it typically backfires. Really, if you're sharing information or even a story about yourself, it should be to help them think through the choices that they're making. I'm going to say a couple words. So we talked about this last 2 weeks ago when we talked about boundaries, but just a reminder, because boundaries are everywhere, right? It's the personal limits. So they're material, mental, physical, and emotional. And a lot of really what we're dealing with around, excuse me, around sex and sexuality is mental, physical, and emotional boundaries, right? helping our young people understand their boundaries, and also understanding the three most important things is that their boundaries are theirs, regardless of what anyone thinks. Their boundaries can change, and they can have different boundaries with different people, right? So understanding those three things is really important to keep hammering home. The other thing, consent needs to be talked about through all of it, and I'll just go back over what we talk about when we talk about consent. We talk about it being freely given. That means, and specifically with 14 to 18-year-olds who are potentially engaging in sexual activity, right? It means it can't be coerced. It means you can't guilt someone into it, right? Don't you love me? I thought you cared about me. We've been together for so long. The person cannot be intoxicated, right? Even if both, and we have this conversation a lot, even if both people are high or drunk, consent is not there, right? And so how do you think about freely given? Reversible. Someone can stop at any time, and the great thing to say is, this doesn't feel right anymore, right? Something doesn't feel right. So then it's not about the person that they're with, it's just about it doesn't feel right. And helping them think through what happens. Your partner might get really upset. That's okay, right? So often what our young people are afraid of around their boundaries is hurting other people. And so teaching them how to handle rejection and also how to handle when you upset someone and still hold to your boundaries. Informed. This is where STIs come in and also some general language. Making sure that you know what you're getting into, right? Hooking up can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It might mean sex to one person, it might mean kissing to another, right? So you don't get into a really uncomfortable situation, making sure that your kid understands how to talk about specifics. And then also, if they are sexually active, how to talk about STIs and how to talk about getting tested. Enthusiastic. This is where some of those nonverbal communication skills come in, right? So a person might say yes, and a person might say yes and start engaging in sexual activity, but let's say two people are kissing and they're really kissing, and then one person moves their hand to the other person's genitals. And then they say, are you okay with this? Person B says, sure. But all of a sudden, they're less enthusiastic. All of a sudden, they're looking away every once in a while. Their body seems stiff, right? As uncomfortable as it is, they got a yes, but it was not enthusiastic, right? Specific. What are you agreeing to? A lot of times people think, and especially like in the movies, that you start kissing, that is like a landslide to all these other things. And people say, well, you don't want to ruin the mood. There's a lot of things that ruin the mood, right? And the other thing that ruins the mood is when you start doing activity that not everybody's okay with. The biggest thing that we talk about is, am I limiting my partner's choices? And have I obtained a clear, freely given, and I'll add enthusiastic yes? So once again, and this is huge around sex, right? It's around any boundaries, but especially because our young people don't have experience with sex. Like, this is something that they have never experienced before. So self-reflection, what do I like? How do I like being touched, right? One thing that's important and actually not discussed a lot is, in talking about masturbation, one of the things is to appreciate how you like being touched so that then you can communicate that, right? How do you know what you're not comfortable with? A lot of our young people, though, don't learn that about sex until they are in the middle of making out with someone, right? They don't learn that they're uncomfortable. And so one of the really important things to talk to them about is that if at any point you feel uncomfortable, it's okay to stop, right? Because a lot of our young people, I can say I did this as a teen. I was uncomfortable with something, but I didn't say stop because I didn't want to hurt the other person's feelings. So before I pause for a second, because I've been talking a lot and really fast, I want to do a word about pornography, because from around 10 to 18, your child will come across it, whether it's by accident or whether they're seeking it out, or whether a friend shows it to them. It is a fact of life. It is not dependent on gender. Um, it is everywhere. And so something that's really important is to, depending on if you start the conversation, right, by asking them if they've ever come across porn, or if you come across them, um, like having porn, right? The way to get into this is to not shame them, right? They're exploring and they're using what they have, and there is so much pornography out there, and pornography creators are smarter and smarter about how to bypass um, any type of firewall or parent block, right? So it's really important to talk, and it's for entertainment. It often has no consent or like safe practices. It is full of misinformation, everything ranging from what real people look like, to what they do and what sexual situations look like. It's really important to compare it to real sex and real relationships, right? And I think it was Lizzie Appleby from um, Glenview Services who used this, and it's amazing, right? You compare it to something they know, right? You don't learn to drive from watching The Fast and the Furious. In the same way, you should not learn about having sex from watching porn, right? If that's The Fast and the Furious is not in your kid's wheelhouse, think of something else, right? But really getting them to understand that, like, this is not what sex looks like. Great. So someone asked, how do you start a sex conversation with teens? I am going to answer that one. So that was the what. Before I go into when and how it's said, which is starting that conversation, are there any questions about the what? I'll just wait for a few seconds because there's so much in this. Okay, I'm going to move on, and if there are more questions, I'll come back to them. So the next thing that's really important is what and how it's said. Oh, one just popped up in the chat. Yes, what if they feel uncomfortable even when you bring it up? I will so get to that because they're going to feel uncomfortable. Like, they're going to feel uncomfortable, you're going to feel uncomfortable, and it's okay. And I will get to kind of what that discomfort looks like and how to kind of keep at it. Okay, so I'm going to give you some general tips. Do not wait for an event or a need. So, for example, right, you always see in movies, like before they go out on a date or before prom night, right, the parent sits them down and has this talk. Do not wait for that moment, because you then feel a sense of urgency, right? And there's going to be fear in there. And what is going to be misinterpreted by the teens is going to be invasion and control, right? Because it is, you see something coming up where they're going to have a good time, and you need to make sure that they know all this stuff right now, right? And so your urgency is going to come through as control. And if we know anything about teens, it is that if we attempt to really assert control, they push back, right? So what this is have small conversations as often as you can, right? If you are uncomfortable, admit it. Admit that you're uncomfortable. Stay calm, right? Admit what you don't know. That's okay too, right? Offering to look things up with them, offering to read a book with them. I have a couple of books that I read separately with my kid, right? She has one copy and I have another, and we come together at night and talk about it. If your kids say something, or if they say something in passing or ask you a question or you see something, try not to jump to conclusions. The most important thing for any interaction with teens is to come with curiosity. What do you want to know about that? Or what do you think that word means? Or why are you thinking about that now? Right? Really try to come with curiosity, even though everything in your mind might be on fire. We call it the duck on the pond, right? So if you think about like that duck on the pond, they look really calm, but underneath, to battle the currents, their legs are going all different sorts of which ways. For your teen, you need to be the duck on the pond. Initially, when you're having these discussions, keep it general, right? Do not talk about them specifically. Don't talk about a relationship that they have specifically if you have not ventured into these conversations before. Reason being is that teens will react to what they see as an invasion of privacy, right? Right? So they will shut down and not want to talk about it. One thing, if you're having talks with them, really think about stereotypes and gender differences. Don't make assumptions about how your young people identify, right? But also really be aware around double standards around gender and sexuality, right? Especially if we talk about the gender binary, quite often when we think about cisgender girls and how virginity is talked about to them, and cisgender boys in a lot of cultures, right? Thinking about like patting them on the back, right? Or like that it's a milestone to lose virginity if you are a cisgender boy. If you're a cisgender girl, it's a different type of milestone, right? It's something that should be coveted and protected. And we need to really kind of dispel our ideas of that and think about what we think about sex in general. I would also say to talk about sexual behavior so that you are inclusive of your kids who identify as LGBTQ, right? You don't want to talk about sex and assume that it's penis and vagina sex, right? You want to talk about sexual behaviors and sexual acts so that your young person can see themselves as a part of it. Use media as teachable moments, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. The car, social media, and text actually act as really great entry points. Sometimes when my young person, and she's on the young end, she's 13, if she's really uncomfortable about something, she and I text, right? If she is so uncomfortable that she can't be in the same room with me, we text about it. It gives a way to have some distance. Same thing with the car, especially if they're in the back seat, because you are not facing them. There is something about face-to-face communication that is just uncomfortable. Oops. Okay, so here's a couple of ways that I'm going to have you talk about it. So one way into it, right, when you respond is soy, some, others, you, right? So the reason why you're doing that is you're normalizing where young people are at with decisions and choices they're making, right? Especially because they see media and think all these different things. They see their friends, and it is terrifying at an adolescent age to be different than your friends, right? So some teens might be having sex, others may not. You might be figuring out what you're comfortable with, right? And follow it up with a simple, I'm here for you. I can also help get information. Wonder aloud, right? Help young people develop kind of their internal stop sign. I wonder how they'll know when they're ready for sex. That's actually something that you can use in the media. Um, when you're watching a TV program, and you might not be watching something where people actually have sex with your child, but sex is implied across ages of TV programs. So now ask, I wonder what they showed that means they're ready for sex. I wonder how people know, right? Start putting stuff out there. You're going to get side eye from your kid a lot. You are, right? I do this professionally, and I have one child who hides under the table, and I keep going. Validate and empathize, right? Validate how uncomfortable this might feel. And it's uncomfortable because we've been taught that we're not supposed to talk about this together. But then also, like, let them know that it's okay to change their mind and advocate for things. Sometimes when we think we want to do something and then we realize we're uncomfortable, always speak up when that happens. And you can add, and if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, find someone else, right? One of the key things is to keep giving them as many outlets as they can of adults to talk to. Okay. So here's some moments in the margins, right? It's not that big sit down moment. It's when you're in the car. I will tell you, my family lives in Detroit, and I can tell you, driving from Chicago to Detroit, we pass lots of billboards for strip clubs. So we have had to have a discussion about sexuality, about why they're using the women that they are around what strip clubs are way earlier than I was prepared for. But it's because my kids are observant and they ask questions about these giant billboards. But really think about this. What would you do if someone you were dating started acting like that character on this TV show? Or what do you think about that relationship? Um, Look for instances in music or TV when consent is absent or when it's empowered, right? When it's empowered, cheer that on. But the other thing to do is sometimes I let my kids pick music in the car. Do not do not pick out a song every single time you let your kids play music in the car, because then it will backfire. But pick your moments, right? Um, think about a specific playlist. Ask your kids to share music with you. Something for older kids too, right? Passing the contraception section while walking through the drugstore. It could really create a good conversation starter. Um, Going into different aisles around, in terms of that, it starts a conversation because it's right there in the open. Have them show you videos on TikTok. I actually will say, and I will try to pull a few before we send out resources. There's actually a plethora of really good um, TikTok people who do sexual health content, and it's good and trustworthy, and I follow it. Um, Share it with them. Share social media with them. The other thing is news. Use the news to talk about what's going on, right? The gymnastics, sexual assault, right? The whole gymnastics team, everything that they went through. Even, I'm trying to think of more news, like sooner related stuff, but like even talking about the women's ski team, getting into talking about the uniforms and how that impacted, right? So using the news to talk about gender and talk about how that starts rolling into sex. So The reason that I skipped how often is because there's not a lot of slides for that. It really is often, early and often, right? Not, don't bash them over the head with it. Don't make every single TV show a talking moment because then it gets old. But find those moments so that it becomes a regular conversation. So here is where we're going to get a little bit into communication around sex, but also communication in general. Because you want to be an askable adult in all areas, including sex, right? So if conversations don't happen around other topics and then they just happen about sex, your teen's spidey sense is going to go off and it's going to be a concern that you don't trust them. Why are you opening this topic with me when we don't talk about other things, right? So really starting to talk about other things that they are interested in, other types of other topics. So these are general strategies for being an askable adult that also go with the sex talk. Be available and willing to talk. They are not always going to want to talk to you. You're going to make them uncomfortable. They're going to tell you that you don't want to. I'm here if you have more questions. Sometimes stay in the room with them, right? Be like, I'm just going to be here if you've got questions. Here's a book. And then let me know if you have questions. And I will tell you, they might be roll their eyes and be like, ugh, mom. And then they'll pick up the book. Avoid shame and judgment. Watch your body language and your words, especially when they are talking about sex. I am someone who needs to watch my face. And it is really hard for me to sometimes watch my eyebrows and make sure that my eyebrows don't go up when my kid tells me something. I have to be that duck and breathe. Validate and empathize, right? Really don't belittle the sexual relationships or sexual interests that they have, right? It is new and adorable and scary for you all at the same time, but it is real for them. And we want to make sure that we validate the importance. Offer resources and education for yourself too. But also, you don't have to be the expert and you don't have to be the only resource. If there are other adults in your kids' circle that you trust, give them information. There's great websites too that that are all encompassed in this one resource that I'll send you, right? So that kids can do some exploring on their own and then come to you. But you want to like make sure that you are crafting those resources for them, that you are not crafting, cultivating those resources for them. We've talked about boundaries, right? And then be curious. As adults, we tend to assume that we know everything. We don't. Ask your kid what they're thinking, right? Really be curious about what's going on in your kid's life, and especially around these topics. So another part, especially around the sex talks and anything, is that communication is key. You need to listen, right? Even if you do not agree with them, if they are talking about a sexual act and it terrifies you, or you're like, I don't want you to have sex till you're married, listen first. Just listen. Hear where they're coming from. Pay attention to the static that is going on in your brain. And that static is all of those worries that you have about them, which is natural, but try to push it down as much as you can while you're listening. When they say nothing, right? So when they won't talk to you, you are still important. You're important through modeling, you're important through getting them resources, right? And being there and verbally saying that you are still there for them, right? We cannot make assumptions about our teens. Offer to connect them with another person, right? Affirm them and be honest. And then another really important one for teens, especially, that I sometimes fall into the trap of is the wait, why am I talking? The ratio should be 1 to 3. If we're having a 15-minute conversation with our kids, we should be talking for 5, and they should be talking for 10. If they are not talking, do not continue talking at them, because then it's not a conversation, it's a lecture. And that is what we want to pull away from. Okay. One attempt won't be magic. Like, I would love it if we could do all these things and then our teens would open up to us and have these beautiful, amazing conversations. It's not going to happen. And I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. The earlier you start, the more comfortable they'll be. But if you haven't started yet, that's okay too, right? It's never too late to start. Providing resources, books, and websites. Asking them who they feel comfortable talking about, right? Reminding them that you're always there to have judgment-free conversations. And you have to mean judgment-free, right? So if it means crafting a space where it's judgment-free, if it means figuring out how you need to respond to them so that they know that it's judgment-free, that's really important. The last big thing, and I use this for everything, is what I call settle your glitter. And it is responding versus reacting, right? So there used to be an app where you could press the emotion that you're feeling, and then it would be like a glitter, like a snow globe, and you would shake the phone as hard as you could, and then the glitter would settle. And while that was happening, a blowfish would come on, and it would expand and close, and it would basically get you to do diaphragmatic breathing so you could calm down. I used to use that with my kids, and then realized I needed to use it with myself. If your kid comes to you with things about sex that make you uncomfortable, you need to pause, right? You need to breathe. You need to check your own emotions. What are you reacting to? Are you reacting to what the kid is telling you, or are you cycling 10 minutes into the future, or 10 years into the future, sorry, and reacting to that? Tell them I can see this versus I understand, right? Because we don't understand. We might have been kids, but they have an entirely different social dynamic than we had growing up. Tell me more versus that, like, what? Be the duck on the pond. And then sometimes, especially in conversations around navigating sex and relationships, what would you tell a friend? Right? So I use this for two different things. And the reason is because a lot of times I use this for self-compassion. If you're being hard on yourself about having these conversations about sex with your kids, imagine if a friend came to you and said the exact same thing. What would you tell them? You have to have a little bit of self-compassion, because having these talks instead of not talking is challenging the way things have been in our country for a real long time. But also, your kids might struggle with decisions that they would make them for themselves, but they're excellent at thinking about their friends. Ask them, if your friend felt this way, what would you tell them? Right? And see what they come up with. And then the last part is know when to call reinforcements. You don't have to be the only person who is talking with your kid. Okay, so let me make sure that I answered all of these. I think I did. And so really, I'm going to stop sharing. Maybe. And I love it. I talked fast. I talked very fast because I wanted to make sure that I had time to answer questions. Blanca, you asked, what if they feel uncomfortable even when you're bringing it up? Hopefully I answered that in the sense of they are going to feel uncomfortable. And it means that you give them an out, but you offer to still be there and give resources, and then try again. Are there other questions? If you learn that your teen is engaging in activity that is dangerous or destructive, where do you turn? That is a great question. So I think there's a couple answers, and one, there's some resources. If you engage, if you learn this, right, this is when it's time to call for reinforcement. So the first thing is to, I'm going to assume that you're learning from your teen. Yes, we will be sharing the slides. I'm assuming that you're learning from your teen that they're engaging in activity. So there's two different things. If you're learning from somebody else, right? Like word of mouth, another parent, all that, that your teen is engaging in destructive activity, the first thing is to use kind of those askable adult techniques to kind of try to open the door, ask them kind of what's going on. If you learn from your teen, try to get them to talk a little bit more about it. But then, depending on what the behavior is, this is when this is where someone like at response, like calling response, calling, you know, calling peer services, calling, this is where you have those resources to help guide you through that, because when it is dangerous and destructive behavior, you're going to need some backup. And the big thing is if they, so I just see you wrote, it's theoretical, but yes, I'm assuming they tell me. If they tell you, one of it is to really, that duck on the pond is really important while you're getting other resources. If they already feel comfortable telling you, asking them about the behavior, like why they're doing it, um, um, why they're doing it, thinking about, sorry, I saw a comment come in and my brain kind of went, thinking about asking more questions, getting them to talk about it, right? A lot of the times is talking about why they're engaging in the destructive behavior and also figuring out at what point they're at. But that's really when you want to engage in other help. Hold on one second. So someone, my son is very quiet. I'm reading these just so that because they don't show up in the playback. My son is very quiet and not into girls yet. I had a kind of talk and gave him a book, but no questions. He's 14. Should I try again? Yes. I think you keep trying and you keep bringing it up, not in big moments, right? Like sitting on the watching TV. There is also like there are people who are not into girls. There are people who are like, so assuming really this is why kind of like we're talk about sex and relationships and try to leave gender, try to not assume gender. Also, there are people who identify as ace, right? Which means they might not express interest in sexual activities, right? So, but 14 is really, that's totally okay. But keep trying. And that's kind of the point of it, is that you don't want to wait until there is expressed interest. You want to start having these conversations before, so you're laying the groundwork. Someone also wrote, I noticed that you talked about STI is a consequence of unsafe sex, but not pregnancy. Oh, well, that was my mistake. But not pregnancy. I believe I would talk about it as well. Is there a reason it's not addressed? No. I think that when we do, it was just a slip on my part. When we talk about sex in terms of STIs, we talk about pregnancy as well. So one of the things um, we talk about both, and we talk about what it takes to become pregnant, and we talk about, but the big thing also to do though is that we pull shame away from STIs and pregnancy. We talk about STIs when, so if we talk about birth control, that's one of the main reasons why someone would get on birth control if they are sexually active, right? So we definitely talk about that. We talk about STIs as well. And if you're going to talk about pregnancy, talking about pregnancy to everybody, but talking about it in a way that's gender inclusive. What are some resources parents can use? So hold on one second, let me put this in the chat and we're also going to send it out. I have, so Response has on our website, we created 2 guides, one for middle school, one for high school. And it is full of talking advice and information and links to resources and full resource pages. And it's in 4 different languages. They are great resources. And then there's, parents.com is a good one, but what I just put in the chat and what we'll share is an excellent place to start with resources. We scoured, making sure that there were really good resources. Hold on one second. My husband checked our son's phone and reacted to him watching porn. He didn't tell him it was wrong, but definitely told him to pick better porn. Sorry. I love that. I mean, I do. So to talk, that's okay. But I think the idea, it's more also though, you want to pull your son into a conversation about, that also means that your son's curious, right? That means that your son is trying to figure stuff out. And also like, why is your son engaged? Like, why are we engaging in porn? What is it about the porn? And if your husband is okay having this conversation, it's not just better porn, right? Like any porn is not realistic. And most porn that people can access is unconsent, like there's nothing from consent. And also there's no female pleasure in most porn. It's not female focused, and any pleasure that it seems like the woman in heterosexual porn is engaging in is really not accurate. And so it's the same thing, right? I would re-engage that conversation and really kind of talk about like the whole Fast and Furious thing about like really figuring out and learning how to have good sex and learning how to please someone you're with. It takes talking and it takes figuring the other person out. So my daughter is 14. Is it too early to talk sex with her? No. This from this whole presentation, my daughter, one of my daughters is, I'm gonna be embarrassed. I was about to call her 10. She's 11. And we've been talking about it. It's all about how you talk about it. And so what I would definitely do is look back at when we send you this, look at some of this. You want to start talking it because she's gonna probably be interested in it for various reasons. Sex, relationships, consent, all of those should be talked about early and often. Because it's you want to have multiple times where you're talking about it. Are there any other questions?
Lisa, I do think there was one in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're right. Thank you. Okay. How do you ask why they're learning what they're learning from social media, like watching pics or videos of women or couples? So what I think from this question, so I'm going to answer this. What I think from this question, how do you ask what they're learning or watching from social media? I watch it with them. I asked my kid, right? So my 13-year-old is allowed to look at TikTok. We put some parameters on it, but it also means that she has to sit with me sometimes and watch it. And we go through some stuff because there's been times where something has popped up and I'm like, nope, we need to curate that out. What do you think about this? And she'll explain to me, oh no, that's not cool. You're right. Right? Or she'll say, I don't understand. Why is this not okay? And we'll talk about it. So part of it is really engaging in the social media with them, understanding that they're going to want to have private things, but engaging sometimes with them in some of it. Let them show you how to use TikTok, right? Let them show you those things and then use that material as a way into it. And then the recommendations for resources to provide to teens about sex. In the link that I put up, there's parent-facing resources and there's teen-facing resources. There are great resources, I think, for middle school and younger. Amaze.org are videos, and there's actually even their cartoons. I'm writing it in right now. Amaze.org. But I will tell you, there's even if your older kids don't mind watching cartoons, there's a cartoon about what happens if you have unprotected sex, right? These cartoons, and you can watch them with your teen and laugh at how ridiculous the cartoon is, and talk about the information that's in the cartoon. But there's some really great. Scarlet Teen is a wonderful resource that is in our resource list. Planned Parenthood, Response, they're all ones, especially if your kids don't actually want books, which I buy books, but if you want them to have it at their fingertips. Are there any scripts you can share with us on how to get the conversation started? That is a good question. I think I don't have a tech, like we kind of some of the starters and the tools to use, like the soy, like some others you, thinking about really out loud, wondering out loud, like I wonder how they know that they're ready. Like if you're watching something, I wonder how some people know that they're ready for sex. Watching something on TV and asking some questions that are in this and also in the resource that I provide of like, those couples are in a relationship together. Does she look like does she or does he, do they both look like they're enjoying what's going on? How do you know? Right? So using it to get that started. So outside of just almost like suggested questions and ways to enter the conversation, I don't have a full script, but I can see if I can find you one, or maybe the resource that we use. So I can actually, what time is it? We have 1 minute. If you look at it, there's a whole section on how to start the conversation in the resource that I put in the chat that will also be sent out. It's literally, there's bullet pointed questions that you can ask and things like that. I think what's important to think about is that as scary as this seems, since we're trying to get you to have the conversations in like different moments, you want to be able to think about the types of questions that you're asking, but they have to be appropriate and fit the moment. So I can see what we can put together for you in terms of resources.
And then I think there was one other question about talking with kids on the autism spectrum or other developmental disabilities.
Yes. So there is, let me write that down. So one of the things so I'm actually trained to teach people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and people who are on the autism spectrum, sexual health. And one of the important things about that is really clear, straightforward answers, right? So, and using visuals, especially depending on, your child's support needs, right? The same support needs that they would have in school, you want to use for these conversations, right? So like I have nonverbal supports for people. You don't want to use euphemisms. You don't want to use metaphors or coded language, which we use a lot with sex because we're uncomfortable. You need to be really clear and specific. And there's actually, there's some great resources that I'll put in I'll send to Erin so she can send it back. but you can buy, one, there's some trainings for parents, and two, you can actually, I mean, you can buy some curriculum that helps you frame the conversation. Um, I will also say that unfortunately, so often for kids who are on the spectrum or have intellectual or developmental disabilities in schools, they are often taken out when sex ed comes in. But thanks to a new law that demands parity across sexual health education, we're hoping to see much more help in that section.
I think we made it through and we are over time, but we will send everything out so everyone has access to it. But thank you so much to Lisa for sharing all this amazing information. As I'm thinking about my 8-year-old, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to talk to her tonight. But thank you, thank you. We will send everything out to all the participants. And yes, this was wonderful. Everyone enjoy the rest of their day. Bye.